Hello.
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 How you doing?
I am exhausted and more to come. Tomorrow's another day for show setup. How about you?
I'm doing fine.
Good. Chugging away.
Yeah.
Have you guys had any of the crazy heat, or is it just always hot there? We've had.
No, it's not hot here normally. I mean, we have a breeze, trade winds, so even if it's really hot, we usually get some really nice breezes.
Nice.
So it makes it livable. But it's not, I'm from South Florida. So
got it. So you're accustomed to the balmy weather.
Well, it's not balmy there. It's sweaty weather.
Right.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Steamy.
Hey, Leslie, haven't seen you on board before. Welcome. Maybe I just missed you if you were on an earlier session, but it's nice to see you.
Thanks for the chocolate recipe too.
The chocolate cake. Okay. Everybody else was like, we're learning bezels. Renee goes, I need a chocolate cake recipe from was it 2 sessions ago?
Yeah. I said, what's better, jewelry and chocolate?
It's a fun little recipe. It's nice because you can make it for people that can't tolerate eggs. So it's not bad. It's not gluten-free, but it's not dairy-free if you make the frosting, but it's a tasty little cake recipe. We're going to give folks another minute or two. I see mostly familiar to me faces, some names anyway. So is anybody going to show me that they've made last week's basket setting? Nobody jumping on that one. Okay. Good thing we're doing more basket settings this week. And I did put a couple things up in the Facebook group. Finally, I realized I'd been neglecting that and hadn't caught up on my paperwork stuff. So we are current up to last session on YouTube videos. And we have some new paperwork that I'm going to show what I found, because it's a cool new to me website for doing some layout work. It's not its original purpose. It looks like it's designed for woodworkers, but we'll have some fun with that. And I put up some of the things I threw out from that website in about 15 minutes, showing ways that you can get perfectly mapped if you need to make your own little diagrams for how you want to map settings on the prongs. When you're doing like the odd numbers, 7, how many of us are going to be able to get exactly the angle we want on a 7 out of any of our templates? So that was fun. And there's a little bonus in there that may help us with our crown settings. So we'll talk about those in a bit. Let's see what else business wise. I want to reiterate that what I posted up on the site, but I don't think I mentioned in last session, which is we will be meeting the next session in August, but then the first session in September on 9/7 is going to be canceled because yay, vacation. But we have this session, next session, and then we'll resume again on 9/21. And I've posted in the guides section what I think will be our targets for both setting of things and the settings that we'll be making during those. Trying to keep in mind that we're going to sort of chase 1 or 2 sessions after we've made a setting. We'll then do the setting instead of keeping them all to the end. Do you have any other business? This is why I make notes for myself. What other notes did I want to cover? Since we have at least one new face, I'm going to reiterate what I say at the beginning of many of these sessions, which is this is not a workshop of John's teaching. This is a workshop of me working through the writings of John Cogswell in this book. And so it's my translation and interpretation of what I see in his notes, plus the benefit of having taken many classes with him. So I can sometimes channel a clarification in a book based on something we've done in one of his workshops. And that we're going to go through and do a little bit of an intro, then a working session and some show and tell. In this case, we're going to start out with a bit of a review of the prong setting we did last time, and then we're going to do some of our catch-up reverse settings from the chapter 3 settings that we still have to do, and then we'll go back in and we'll make a 3-prong basket for a large cabochon so that we can see how it looks different and what else we're checking out when we do that, and then a 7-prong. I don't figure I need to do every possible combination of number of prongs in the book, but a 3 and a 7 means that we've done sort of the extremes of it, and we're going to do some 2 prongs when we look at the marquee setting a little bit further down the road. So I think we'll get enough variation that you guys can extrapolate from that. As always, this is not quite to the intensity of one of my classes. This is really, some of this is me doing things I have done frequently, and some of it is me doing things I have not. And so you'll see my stumblings as much as the things that I'm accustomed to doing. And it's also a little bit of translation of John's amazing drawings that don't always sync up with the notes we see. As always, there's a whole bunch of places you can go to for more following of me and or links to things that you may want, including adding yourself to my mailing list if you choose to. And if you have not already signed up on the Rio for Schools program, I'm going to post that as well. So here is the Rio for Schools link. Again, Rio, oops, maybe here is the Rio for Schools link. Let's try that again. As always, the Rio site is right now under a little bit of transition, so it may take a little more time to get your account tagged with this. It doesn't want to copy. Why does this hate me so in this chat? So it may take a little while. Yeah, it's just not pasting. I don't know what it wants to do. Hang on. Copy file, no. Copy and then paste one more time. Where is my chat now? Paste. Yeah, it's not happening. Okay, well, I will try that again later in the day. Zoom is behaving badly again. But with the Rio for Schools code, which maybe you don't need the whole shebang of directions, I can just tell you that the Rio code you use for me is RFSRMORR. And that will generally give you, I think right now they're down to, it gives you 6 months of equivalent to a Rio Pro benefit, which gives you the next price in the tier. They change it a little bit every once in a while, so I can't be guaranteed of that. And if you're already a pro, it doesn't do you any good, but it does do me some good, even if you're a pro, to tag that and any other teachers that give you a Rio code. You're not limited to having just one teacher's Rio code. It doesn't multiply by the number of teachers you go to, unfortunately, but it does let them know which teachers are really out there promoting their materials and so on. So it has a little bit of benefit both for their marketing and for encouraging them to continue supporting the education stuff. Any questions about any of the business stuff before I dive in? Okay, let's get to it. As always, feel free to unmute yourself and or pop something into chat, although as I told you, chat is behaving poorly, so I may or may not see it right now. But it's okay to unmute and give me your thoughts or your questions. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is talk about what we accomplished on the last setting. And it looks so tiny on that giant piece of white paper. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. And center, there we go. That's a little better. So this was our first of the basket settings. I have done nothing to it other than pickle it and start to file it, but I didn't even have time to finish that. And on this one, we did a not terribly big difference between our upper layer and our lower layer. So it doesn't look like a very big taper, but remember that we could have tapered it more. And next session, I expect that we'll do the cutting in of the positions of the prongs so that it sits well in the seat. And he has two different ways that he talks about it in the book. He talks about doing it by hand, and he talks about doing it with burrs. Burrs are super easy for the round ones, but one of the reasons he starts with the hand cutting in is that when we get to funkier shapes, it's going to be a lot easier to get into some of the unusual points and corners and stuff if you already know how to do the hand preparation for those little points that we're going to have the stone resting against. And it gets even funkier when we get to some of the very cool versions of this, like one of my favorites that he does is the teardrop setting that has a combination of the prong and sheet bezels. So any leftover questions? Oops, now I'm going to zoom back out so that I'm not quite so close.
Sorry, Rachel.
Yep.
I missed a few sessions, but I'm wondering what you mean by hand setting.
Using, I'm sorry, I'm giving you guys weird stuff on the screen, bear with me. I mean, using files to cut in. Oh my gosh, this is my technology is gonna kill me. Oh, I'm just hitting bright and I'm not hitting zoom. Hang on. So yeah, so the first version that he shows us in the book is using a combination of round and, let me get back in frame, round and barrette and crossing files to cut in where we're going to rest the stone. And then he also has us do a version of it where we're doing it with setting burrs is his preferred, but you can also use the heart burrs or the other ones that I can never remember that are the other angle of the heart burrs. So yes, we're going to do both because there are points at which we will have to do it by hand in some of our later settings.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. And a reminder that all of the previous sessions are in fact available. Oh my gosh, my technology just wants me to fall over today. Hang on. I have to get you guys zoomed out. Maybe it's the fact that I have something white is making it not want to register. I'm not a fan of Apple, which is what this particular device is on. Almost. Okay, you guys are seeing my bench pin again, right? Finally, right? Yes. Okay. All right. So that's this setting. We're going to continue on some more in the series, but before we do, we're going back a ways to make sure that we hit the reverse settings. So what I want to show you is what I have rigged for the two reverse settings that we're going to do, which we have back on, oh, where was it? Hey, like towards the very end of chapter 3, if you're following along in the book, we have on page 81 into 83 is where we have the reverse bezels section. And one of the versions that he did was creating a reverse set bezel where we put a ring in there. So this ring that we can put in is in lieu of cutting. Remember when we did some of the harder to set because there's too much material to push over, he had us do a serration. So one option on this reverse setting would be to do a serration. On the other, it's a ring that we're setting it over, which gives us something that we're going to be able to curve our metal over. So we're going to try that version. Buried in my thermolock is a fairly long bullet cut, and it's coming in from behind. So we're going to do one of those. And then the other is, if I didn't lose my cap, is the cap set, which I like to think of as acorn set. And so this was where we made the setting in our setting block and made it at an angle so that the stone sets down into it. This is a conical taper. and then made a cap that we've left enough room, and we're basically going to bezel set our cap onto it. In this case, it's a slippery little guy. So last week in prep, I glued the piece into place. You could use either a temporary glue or count on it as part of the permanent if it's moving around on you a lot, but whatever the case, it gives us that ability to hold that in place, because what was happening was every time you try to put any pressure against it, it wants to slip out like a little watermelon seed out of the layer. Okay, so those are our two settings that we're going to go for today. I'm going to start with the one with the wire, which is just a very, very snugly fitted jump ring. It'd be great if I can figure out where all my parts are. Let's see. So I'm just holding it in here for the sake of stability. Probably I should cut half of this off, but it's there, it's ready. I'm going to work with it. And what I'm curious about, because I have never done one of these, is whether this is something that I will be able to even set by hand, or whether I'm going to have to hammer set it. So I'm going to start my process with a traditional bezel pusher, and I'm expecting that I'm going to have a lot of pushover. What I did do, just like with our heavier bezels, is I did file that edge at the top down a little bit, so I'm not pushing quite so much material. And I'm going to be pushing down the north, south, east, west directionals like we do on everything else until I've caught that that jump ring in place as if it were, again, some kind of bezel. A little more push on the other side. So I'm curious as to what the level of effort is on this particular kind of setting, and frankly, whether it's worth it. I love reverse settings, but I tend to do them as full-fledged, like I'll do a faceted stone and I'll just put a step bezel or hat. So I'm just flipping the stone. But this is theoretically going to look a lot cleaner than it would if it were, you know, a traditional step bezel. So once I've started to get it pushed over, then I can look for my lumps, just like with any other bezel setting, and work the lump and the opposite side. Again, super key to this is that jump ring is hard to get in place level of tight. You don't want it floating around, because especially if it's hard to get fully pressed down, it's going to jingle around in there. We don't want it moving. That'll put a greater risk of it opening up over time. And in general, this kind of setting is going to be resting against skin or something like that, because it's in the back side of it. Maybe not if you're doing an earring with it. So since I've filed it, it's not impossible to push. It's still a bit of effort. And I'm concerned because I'm doing a lot of chicken winging. I also think I'm probably sitting a little too low. Positioning yourself well. Yeah, I was definitely on my low side on the chair. Positioning yourself well is going to make a big difference to this. Sure I'm not blocking you guys. Okay. So it's still an up and over. The nice part is it doesn't risk scratching the stone really, because the stone is way down in there. So I'm having an opportunity to push a little harder. And I'm just looking for the lumps, same as I do on a regular bezel setting, and work in the opposites. What I can't tell is whether I filed down low enough. I may have given myself too much material at the top. I was erring on the side of leaving excess to make sure I really got over the ring. But I suspect that I probably could have taken about 0.5 millimeter down from what I did. Has anybody else played around with reverse settings in any of their work? Any discoveries you've made? Anybody even set stones upside down, even if it's not a reverse setting? Faceted stones with the roulette pointing up or anything?
No.
Look at the backs of your stones too. Sometimes, I mean, you have to be careful that it's not super pointy, but some of them are worth play. Was there more to that? No, I'm sorry, I interrupted.
No, I mean, is that a thing that you can set them upside down? I mean, downside up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, especially if it's a well-cut faceted stone. Because if you think about it, there's still a platform you can rest it on most often I've seen them done on a shoulder bezel. It's the challenge is, is it good for a pointy ring that might get banged around? Is it good for a bracelet that lands? It's going to depend on the stone because you're putting the most fragile part of the cut facing outward when you do that. But
I've
for
played
example,
with it, but not seriously.
Yeah.
But I kind of set it like like I'd set a cabochon almost.
yeah, exactly. It's basically, I mean, if you think about it, a rose cut stone is kind of like a bastard love child of a cabochon and a faceted stone. Just doesn't have such a steep coulant on it.
Oh yeah, you're right. I didn't think about that.
So, yeah.
Rachel, could you pin yourself, please?
Oh, thank you very much. The thing I always forget. I'm just sitting here in small scale. No wonder I'm wondering why it's so far away. Thank you for that reminder.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so look at your stone collection. I mean, like, there's some fairly brittle stones out there that I probably wouldn't risk it with. But one of the places I like to do it a lot is if I'm putting a decorative element on a clasp, so that I know it's going to be behind the neck. It's not going to take as much abuse. It's not like on a ring where they might bang it on the table. And it just adds a cool, like, heck, you take a square stone that has a neat cut to it, and it makes a little pyramid in your work because it's pointing back upward from that square. So what I'm not liking, and I can't tell whether it's how I've got it positioned or not, is that it's slipping a little. Could be how it's positioned. It could be that I did a better job of filing an even surface on one side than the other. So I suspect my stone is a little off center right now in terms of it may not be pointing directly up and down, which unfortunately, when I've got it buried in the jet set, I can't entirely tell. The only reason I'm thinking that is that it feels like one side of my jump ring is lifting, as if I had not done a good job of balancing my north, south, east, west push. So I'm going to see if I can even get that jump ring further down.
Oh, Rachel, you're frozen. Oh, no,
Um,
you're not frozen anymore.
Good.
I don't have you at all. Are you spotlighted?
I am spotlighted. Let me try going off spotlight and back on. I tell you, the
Others,
technology
we can
gods.
see you all right.
You can, some of you can. Here, hang on
It
just
may
a
be
sec.
there.
Yeah, I can see you.
Okay.
I
here.
can't see you as a spotlight.
Betsy, can you go to gallery view and then go to speaker view on your own screen?
Yes.
Did that switch me back to being in front of you?
Let me.
Oop, you shouldn't be able to move me out of it.
Here, now I've got you. Okay.
Yeah, but then it goes back
And-
to
And then I'm going to oh, and then
Oh,
I've got
hang on a
this
sec. I
one.
think I know what I've done. I think I've pinned me instead of spotlit me.
There you go.
Spotlight for everyone. There. How am I doing? Am I
Better.
showing up big
That
for
works for
everybody?
me. Thank
Okay.
you.
I just need like 3 more days before my show that starts tomorrow. All of which I want to spend sleeping. What else? So yes, as I was saying, I'm feeling that there's a little bit of lift. So the whole principle of this particular setting that John is describing to us is that we need something that acts as the equivalent of that hold down that we get from having the curve of a stone, right? So when we're doing a traditional cab or something like that, it's holding it up along the curve. When we're doing a faceted stone, it's folding it over the table a little bit, well, to the outer facets anyway. And so by adding this jump ring, what we're doing is creating something that the downward pressure is wrapping around. Because we had a flat back stone on this cut, we can't just push the whole ring of metal down, we have to either put dividers in it so that it's like prongs or like serration folding down, or in this case, we're trying to work it over material that acts as the curve that we would have had were the stone pointing the other way. I hope that made some kind of sense. But if my, essentially the ring equaling the stone is slipping out of position, same as it would if I were pushing too hard on one side of a traditional bezel setting, then it's going to tip a little bit. And so it won't surprise me once I uncover this if I find it tilted a little bit. It doesn't help that I'm using fairly inexpensive stones, so they're not super roundly calibrated on their bullet layer. And I'll also remind you that buried deep in where this is positioned, one of the things I did was burrow out a little bit of material so that if there is too much downward force on the point of the stone, hopefully I've given it a little pocket that it can push into. Otherwise, I may be putting enough pressure on it that I would snap or chip the stone in some way. All right, so I'm thinking I've got a decent first pass, but I think I may not get much further by hand. So my choice is either hammer set by hand or using hand tools, or hammer set with the micromotor. But before I do that, I'm going to bring it over to the close-up mirror, close-up camera for you guys so that you can see where we are in this set. And see if I can zoom this in nicely. Whoop. So, make sure it's a little shiny to really see. So what I've been doing is pushing this outer wall over this inner jump ring that is snugly fitted in there. And I want it to not move and not be able to pop out, because it's the pressure of that is pushing the stone down. If you recall, this stone, those of you that were with us on this session, this setting is the one that we cut a hole in the back plate that we had at a very slight angle following the stone. So we did the, we angled the tube that we made, and then we angled the plate inside of that. So it was following the curvature of the stone. I'm going to draw that one back at the bench, because it's been a long time since we made this setting. And so it'll make more sense if you see the what it's doing functionally. But here I'm getting closer to the, just not down far enough. And I think the hammer set is going to do the trick for us. So before I do that, let me draw back to this one. Here's my handy dandy whiteboard and high-tech eraser. Okay, so as a reminder of what is buried in that setting material is we have a tube that we made that we filed the inside of so that it started to make that channel that we're pushing the stone down through. And then we put it on a heavy back plate and we drilled a hole and continued that path, that angled line through the back plate, through the, I think it was like 16 gauge or something like that. So that when we go through and push our stone down into it, what we end up with is the stone resting inside that angle. And the act of putting this jump ring up here resting at the top, right? We're now pushing this material over the jump ring. So that what we're doing is pushing it down just like it was a setting so that it wraps around it, around the donut of the jump ring, pushing it down. So if we were to do a cutaway view when it's fully set, we would see this with our little jump ring sitting in there, pushed into place. Below that is the stone itself.
The whiteboard's off camera.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Below that is the stone itself. And then if we were to slice down really carefully, we would see the angle that's created in these two parts of the setting, right? So this is what you see. If you're looking at the book, it's the stuff that we did on the bottom of page 82. And that's obviously just one side of it. So you'd have the same thing happening. So the force of the ring being in place acts as our curve of the equivalent being the curve of the side of, say, a cabochon. Questions? Okay. I'm going to move back to hammer setting, and all my setting hammers are currently packed away. So I'm going to do this by machine. I didn't even think about that. My key hammers for doing that setting are in my show kit right now. And so I'm just using the micromotor that we talked about in the last session or the session before. I'm using a basic setting bit. This is sort of my go-to is the blunted rectangular one. And in this case, I'm going to be working up and over. And so it's a same lift action that I was doing with the manual tools. I can occasionally, if I need to, push in from the side, but I think I've already gotten mostly up and over. So this is the push down that I'm looking for. And in this action, I may be able to do some correction of the slight shift if I'm careful and push down more on the side that's lifting up than not. I'm repeating the north, south, east, west, and then the, what are they called? Orthogonals or diagonals. Just to continue that pressure as evenly as I can around the set. And then I go back to where do I have the lumps? I'm definitely getting some more lifts on this side. So when I'm seeing the lift, what I'm now fighting to do is I'm going to, the side that's lifting up, I'm trying to push a little further down before I go back to the other side.
Rachel, are you
Yeah.
using power or
I
you're
am,
just
yeah.
using?
Sorry, oh, it's not completely in view. This is the this is a Fordham micromotor and hammer handpiece. And there's a little bit on it in the section that I can't remember whether it was last session or the session before where I went over it. The hammer handpiece, there's two different basic types in the micromotor world. One is, or in the handpiece world, one is the more common one, which is one you can get for your regular Fordham or flex shaft, but that is constantly on. The benefit of the micromotor is that it's a pressure sensitive jackhammer. So even though this is clicking, it's not bouncing until I put pressure on it, and then it starts to move.
Oh, so that's why it's really hard to hear.
Yeah, sorry.
Zoom is not letting the clicking sound through, which sometimes is good and
Oh no. I wonder if I change the speed, whether it'll help or hinder. Here, let me try. Are you hearing jackhammer?
No, but you said something about this specific handpiece you have for the micromotor not being available anymore.
So the micromotor is what they moved to a newer model on the micromotor. This is one of their original brands from Fordham, and it was that one of the fellows who does a lot of their education work. When I was teaching at a school that had one of these, and he said, boy, if you can find one of these, they're workhorses. He preferred them to the functionality of their then newer models. They've since put out two refreshed versions of it, both of which are amazing. And there's that little pocket one that you can get that has a battery powered option, so that if you're doing traveling to shows and to schools and classes and stuff like that, you can use it. I would love one of those, but it's not in my budget right now. And I like my little, like there's personal memories to this one because the school I first started teaching at had one. And so I went searching for one on Etsy and eBay and things like that and finally found one.
I have the portable one and it's great as long as you don't need a lot of torque.
Right. Yeah, that's the downside of the
yeah, but it's very handy to have, you know, to take with you.
And frankly, most settings shouldn't need a whole lot of pressure. It's really the repetitive action that we're going for with these. If you think about it, this is just a machine version of what if I were a hammer setting, if I were a hand hammer setting, I would be doing some kind of tap or some kind of nail of some kind. Like my favorites that I've talked about in earlier sessions, which are the modified versions of these. This is my go-to. I don't do most of my settings by machine. When I'm setting my silver bezels, I'm usually putting my texture in at the same time as I'm setting it. And so I'm using a ground down nail and then a lightweight hammer, not a lot of weight. So I'm using that tiny little, it's packed away right now, or I'd show you, but that tiny little almost riveting hammer scale of tap, tap, tap. It's not the pressure so much as it is the directionality and the repetitive movement that we're doing. So I'm going to try and go through this with the noise factor, but we'll see because it's getting better. And so I'm looking at the up and over. Any place that I'm not up enough, I need to start a little further back on the angle. And anything that I'm feeling like I'm getting close into that circle, I'm pushing the over a little bit more. So it's starting to push down onto the ring better. So I have a feeling that I'm at a point where this is not coming out no matter what I do. It just is, it looks like it's going to catch a whole lot of crud. And one of the interesting things is that I'm finding I can actually do not just up and over, but up, over, and tucked back in because we're following the donut. Whereas normally if I were going up a stone wall, I would stop because I'd hit the stone. So what's helping tighten this down is a little bit of the over, which you can again do by hand. It doesn't have to be a power tool. It keeps pushing it beyond just across the jump ring and into wrapping around the jump ring. Right, I'm going to pause there and bring it over to you guys. I think it probably needs another small pass or two to get really tight, but that discovery is that it really needs to come back over. Let's see if I can get any closer on this. Oh, I can, just not that close. There we go. So it looks sloppy as heck. I'm going to probably need to do some filing and burr cleanup with this. But what you'll now see is that my lip has come down back over the ring. So that ring is well tucked under there. And the setting is holding it in place. There's on this side, I'm doing a little bit more of this, the hold down than over here. So I've left a little gap that still needs to get pushed down right up at the top here. But it's an intriguing concept of if you have a flat back and you want to push it through your material, you know, think about what happens if you start working into your hollow form design, stones that are popping back out from the back. or if you've got multi-level stuff, if you're doing a lot of rivet work, and so you've got some levels to it. There's all kinds of potential for being able to set something where it's invisible from the back, from the front. So all we should see is a smooth surface on the front edge of our piece, which is going to be the opposite side of this little washer that I put it in. I'd obviously, if I weren't doing this just for a practice piece, I'd put it in something more interesting than simply a round disc, perhaps. But I like what it's doing in terms of the hold down. Like there's not a whole lot of opportunity for movement under there because the downward pressure is so consequential. Questions on that so far?
So what is holding the actual stone?
The fact that it's being shoved down into a perpetually narrowing tube. So down in here, the tube narrows down. Oops, sorry, no, off camera. So down underneath the plate, there's a little hole that it's too narrow for this end of the stone to get through.
Got
So
it.
all we're doing is holding it against that wall.
Got it. I forget that you made the settings first and now
Yes.
you're doing, okay.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, this is catching us up on the setting that was done on page 8, what did I say, 83, 85, somewhere in there. And so once I pull it back out of the setting, we'll be able to see that it's held nice and snugly through. This is, so were I to do this exact setting again for this stone, I would definitely be getting my stone further down. Like I don't actually care for how tall I've left this.
Mm-hmm.
It may be because of the taper, it was just that hard to get it to go further down. Part of it is that I could have gotten a little lower on the lip I was using, but now that I'm seeing it tucked back over onto the ring, not much lower. There's just a little bit on one side that's part of what's making me think it's pushing up. That gives this a little bit more lift than I need. I just don't want that much jabbing into somebody if it's resting against their body or something like that.
Right. Thank
So
you.
the mechanic of it appeals to me. I'm not sure this particular setting does the trick. More questions or thoughts on this? Okay, I'm going to do one more quick pass to see if I can get the last of that flattened out, and then we'll switch to the other stone, which is going to be a slightly different exercise in setting. But all the concepts sort of come from the same basic principle of, does it hold it down? So I think that's as far as I'm willing to go without pulling this piece out and checking it from the other side. But it's now fairly snugged down around the ring. And what it reminds me of, which is a little hard for you to see, even if I bring it to the up close camera, it reminds me a little bit of like, it's basically the mechanism. If you look at the back side of a snap, like for dungarees and things like that, it's held in place, the same principles of you push one side of your snap through the fabric and the other wraps around it and gets enclosed. That's the same principle that we're doing here. We're just using one ring inside of the outer grab material that we've got in the form of the bezel we created. So
Yes.
principle is the same. There's a lot to be learned from other mediums about what we're seeing here. Questions on that one? Okay, if I can get this undone, we'll go to the cap setting. I've been looking forward to this one because it's just so cute. Acorn cap. And so very, very important down in there, I dug out a bunch of the material so that I'm, again, not pushing my stone against hard material. This one's not even staying in here. I'm just counting on the shape of it, holding it in place. It's just, I needed a resting point to control the piece as I was setting it down. And as a reminder, this design is a taper that we set our stone into. Again, in this case, I glued it to keep it from slip sliding around on me. And then the setting is controlled by the sake of the cap. Once again, showing the idea of making something equivalent to our sidewall of a cabochon, right? It's just holding that in place. So we're now taking the outer lip of the taller than the stone frame that we made, and we're going to use that as the bezel that encloses the cabochon that is the top cap. And if you're following along at home, this is the one at the top of page 82. The drawings along the top there. So once again, I'm going to start this activity, seeing how much I can do by hand. Again, it's going to be a little slippery because it's not really set down into the material. So I'm going to have to sort of hold and position over and over again. But it's much thinner material than we were working with on the other one. I think we did this in 26 gauge. I have to check my notes. But boy, it wants to slip around right now until we get that first catch point. So I'm still going with that north, south, east, west concept. And then the diagonals. And one of the tricky bits on this is going to be not putting any pressure on the cap in such a way that I start to crush it. I can easily see myself doing that. But it has some strength because anytime you put any curvature into your metal, it immediately is stronger than when it's flat sheet. Right, downward force is put in play than I need for this exercise. I may have undersized the cap. Even looks like. So I would have expected by now that I'd have it holding a little bit, but it's really moving around a lot. I'm going to try a recovery move. I'm going to try to open this dome up a little bit, even though it already has a jump ring on it. And let's see, how am I going to try that? I am going to pop the base in and use that jump ring to my advantage. And then I'm going to try and dome it out a little bit with a block. I always forget the term for the rods. What are these called? A dapping tool. That's what I want. There's words in my head. I swear. I just had an 8-hour day on the day job and not all there yet. Okay, so too big. I'm going to go for something a little bit smaller to start. There's my depth. Let's set this a little smaller. So I'm going to try some very gentle hammer tap. Do not you do this at home, gang. Don't use a steel tool on a steel tool, but both my mallets are packed up right now. So all I'm doing is trying to widen the curve of the cap a little bit because I want it to be closer to the edge of what I'm doing. Almost there. So again, as I've said in other sessions, sometimes what we learn the most from is our recovery from a surprise or a challenge that we run into. Okay, that makes me happier. So don't feel, in my early years of work, I might have gone rushing off to make a whole new cap. Don't always assume that's your first action. See what you can do to restore or change or evolve the piece that you're stuck on. Oops, wrong one. In some way that gets you there through fewer steps, doesn't lose the work you've already put into it. Oh my goodness. I don't know if you guys can hear the weird hooting in the background, but we've got some invasive species of owls out here. And it's my favorite noise out in my back wooded area is to hear the owls hooting as they do the little call and response. Drives my cats crazy. Okay, so we're now a lot closer to it being a snug fit, and it feels like my setting actions are more likely to actually hold the cap eventually. Slippery little suckers. And this is an intriguing balance of how high up you need it to come to actually catch the cap versus how much you're going to be able to push it back down if it's too tall. Because we need to sort of just barely grip it in order to get over the fold, because we're coming out and then back in on this, unlike a more traditional setting. It really wants to move. I'm super glad I did the glue thing, because I'd be throwing this across the room if I didn't put that Loctite bit of glue. And I'm wondering from the positions I have to do, I'm going to actually try using a tool that I've told you guys I don't use a whole lot. I don't tend to like bezel rockers, but the modification that Chris Plouffe taught me, where you take down the edge of one side, feels like it might be about perfect to get us where we want to go on this push down. Oop, if I don't scratch my stuff, because it's a rock across. Let's see if that gets me anywhere. If it is, that's going to be a magical second use for this. So what I'm doing is I'm rolling. I've got the cutaway resting just below the lip of what I'm pushing in. And I'm just rocking across it to try and give it a shove inward towards the cap. And it's doing something. I'm not sure it's doing enough, but we'll see. This may be a go back and forth between various tools exercise. All right, this is one that's going to take a fair amount of patience to get to the point where you feel like you're actually holding anything in place. So it's starting to get a better fit, but still pretty wussy. Let's try our magical power tools and see if they improve things. I'm not sure they will, or I may want to change tips to the rocker tip instead of the flat. We'll see. Pedal. Well, it's clearly not tight enough yet. Ah, the glue came unglued. Okay. So what I'm having is because I'm putting so much pressure on it, I'm popping it back out. So the glue released, which is part of why I'm having so much wobble. I wonder if it is worth continuing. Let me see if I can get enough downward pressure to hold them despite that. If not, I'll glue it again and we'll touch it up next time. It really is like trying to set a little acorn into its cap. You have to get it past that certain magical spot where it pops right in there. Probably going to need some more glue. So let me bring it over and show you guys what is happening up close, because we're definitely getting, what I can't tell is whether it's just that it's popped out of the glue or whether I'd actually not given myself enough height. Come back here, there we go. So you can see that it's starting to close around the curve. And if I pop this out, you'll see it's definitely started curving over, but it also, because it's not glued solidly now, it wants to shift out of place. What I really need is for it to be nice and snugly down in so that there's enough room for when I push the cap in. Oops, I'm out of screen, sorry. When I push the cap through, I actually am holding it in place. Right now I'm catching one side or the other, but it keeps shifting on me. And it wants to tip one way or the other, which makes it really, really hard to get it flat and caught. So I think I need to pause that one, re-glue with a little more glue and let it set. And then we'll come back and finish setting it on another session. Questions before I go that route? Okay, I think it'll be a really fun little setting once it's, I don't know if you guys can see, once it's done. It's kind of cute. Good dangle off of the end of a pendant, off of an earring. If we can get past the frustration factor. All right. Now we move on to making some more basket settings. So let me get a couple tools clear on my bench so then a little bit less chaos than I presently do. And I pre-stretched some silver, pre-straightened-ish, some of the silver 16 gauge wire that we'll be using, so that we don't have to sit through that. And I want to talk about this magical website that I found where you can make your own semi-templates. So I'm going to pop, if my Zoom will agree, I'm going to pop a website up. And hang on a sec. Into chat. And you can play along at home, but I'll also bring it up on screen. Oh my good, there we go. Okay, hold on, get rid of the extra junk on that link. All right, so that is the link to the page that I'm about to bring up on screen for you guys. And it's how I made the template that I posted. There are boatloads of, you can buy jewelry specific templates. There's all kinds of, oh my gosh, Zoom, please behave. There's all kinds of pre-made templates, pre-made plastic forms, all different kinds of things. But I saw this and I went, huh, that looks super useful. Let me bring it a little fuller scale. There's way more settings than you want to play around with probably. And it's designed, like I said, for probably for woodworking and stuff. But let's say I want to do a 7 increment setup and I want to have some lines in there so that I can see, and I want to have my marks. Oops, not my outer marks. I want to have overline and line to center. So boom, I have an already mathematically mapped out for me layout for a 7-prong setting with evenly spaced out settings. And then you can play around with, how big it is and stuff like that. Yeah, super cool. Ultimately, as long as you have a center point on a stone, it's not exclusively needed for, like, it can help you, if you're careful about it, it can help you do it on other than round stones too. You just have to maybe add some framing into it so that if you're doing a square stone, you lay out the square so that it has a center and layer, like if you did these on tracing paper or something, you could layer them and it would help you line things up. And then there's a bonus, there's a whole bunch of other tools here, which are worth poking around at. But the one that makes me very happy, because we all know just how much I hate drawing out a cone for our settings, is the cone template. It's not perfect because it only lets you do whole numbers. So if you have a specific size of stone that's a weird unit, you can't quite get there. And I haven't tested this one yet, but I'm mapping out one and printed out an image for a stone that I'm going to see if I can go to my crown setting from that, because it makes me super happy. Then you just have to learn what the differential is to give you the angle that you want and so on. But it does some really nice things. Like it tells you a lot of information about the layer that you're working on and the angles and stuff like that. And you can put segmenting in there. So you can, if you only want to see a third of your cone or a half of your cone, you can choose like, this is what's going to make your full cone. And then there's this cool thing, like, let's say you want to make conical box objects. If you've read Tim McCrate's great book on boxes and lockets, he has a couple of cool projects in there. Well, I mean, they're work from people where instead of soldering together, they're using a tab set to put things together. This makes you a conical with a tab for doing an overlap. So if you were to cut this out of copper and create your tabs out of it, you could just slot it together and you'd be done. There's some amazing little play tools in here. And so I just screenshot, or you can actually do an export to a fancier file format and put it into a Word document and then PDF it or something, or you can move it straight to PDF. I just wanted a bunch on one page. So play around, look at some of these. Some of them are going to be not terribly useful to us. I was hoping the oval template would give us something equivalent to the circle, but it doesn't quite do the same thing in terms of the line mapping. But if you're doing anything with stars and you want to have a perfectly scaled star cutout template, there's great stuff in here. So with that, what I did for you guys was, let me see if I can bring it up in PDF form. No, I just bring it up in the pixel layouts. Is that what I was looking for? Yeah, just bring this up. Oh, come on, move Word document. Okay, so I just did a series of them progressively after I found the settings I liked, and I wanted two different versions. There's two prong layouts that, I mean, two options for how many layers of the circle you have, depending on which tool you're in. But the other cool thing that I found going a little deeper is that the version, I can't remember which tool it was, but the version of the tool that let me do this could also have offset settings. So if you're looking for a double prong situation, like if you're putting a marquee together and you want outside of the point of the tips, you could map it out that way and you can choose your angle and set it up like that. And then they also have some other shapes where you can map out where your points would be. So you could get towards a trillion setting, square setting, hex, etc. And you can set as many sides as you want. So if you have some even more unusually shaped sizes, you can do what you want there. It doesn't give you quite as many options for mapping out your points. It's just the cross points or the center points, and then you have to go from there. But it's a great starting point. So play, and also know that if you print out the PDF I added to the Facebook group, you'll have a lot of these. Questions on that? Tool time, fun time. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing on that and go back to using one of those templates, because we are about to do a 3-pointer. Let me bring that up on my bench. 3-prong cabochon. So on page, what page was I on for this section? Variations. We are really working, starting on about page 100 right now, where down in the pictures, he has the steps. They're not really outlined in the paragraphs so much as he has great images for us, and then he details the ways to lay out the multiples. And what I want to point out is image number 2 and the notes on note 1 are sort of 1 and 2 are the starting point of getting connected. So this is about making a clean solder point in our prongs, and we're going to do that using our 3-part layout. If I can figure out where I just put down the stone. Oh, there it is. So if I have this stone and I'm doing a 3-parter, boom, I'm laid out. Now, nothing says you have to do your prongs equidistant. My strong recommendation is that if they're not equidistant, they are at least radically visibly not equidistant, because a little bit off center, people's eyes take as, oops, I made a mistake. But when it's intentionally, you know, if I had 2, I could, let me actually mark this up. That's the other thing, make boatloads of these and mark them up with some other variations. So if I were going to do something intentionally off center, I might choose to do that. And then those 2, right? For some kind of like a crow's foot, 2 coming in from one side and 1 from the other. As long as you don't have a stretch where it can slip out between them, you're in good shape. The 3-prong points will hold it. It doesn't have to be the equidistant. I'm going to do the equidistant for this one because it's a good exercise in how we need to work on our precision when we're doing the prongs. And so I know that this can tell me roughly what I need. You know, I can give, it happens that I made it of a reasonable size, that if I just trim up some wire and give myself a bend that matches about that. Whoop. Drop it. It's 1 point. And again, especially if I'm working in silver or copper, I'm going to always, err on the side of giving myself more material, not less. So 1 piece is twice as long. Neat. Okay, we're just cutting another because I don't feel like going diving. So 1 piece is twice as long as the other, give or take, if you've given yourself enough excess. And in the middle of it, we're going to do a simple bend. You can do it with your fingers. You can get your pliers. If your wire's not straight, now is the time, absolutely, that it needs to start becoming straight. And all I'm doing is starting to find that angle. Oops, I went overboard. Of the 1/3 that I have marked out on my page. Again, wanting to make sure that if I start to stray from a straight line, I straighten it back out in the course of things here. How nice is that to have a template that I can rest it on, right? And then my other piece is going to be the straight mark out of this side. Okay. Now, next up is to put a notch in the corner of the double part. So I'm just going to grab a triangle file or a round file or something. If I can find my triangle file. Gosh, my bench is a mess when I pull stuff out for shows. And I'm just putting it at the peak. If you need to, I may need to on this. Start it with the saw blade cut. Oops, I don't have the right blades in though. Just doing some wood cutting with my tools. Not a wax burner. It's coming right there. I kind of find the odd numbered settings more intriguing than basic. Like, I don't do a heck of a lot of 4-prong set things. They kind of bore me, frankly. I want something that has a little bit of surprise to it. And the odd number ones really appeal to me. So just notching it up right at the peak. Can get a hold of things. And you don't want to cut all the way through because that kind of defeats the purpose. But you do want to make a notch that's going to give us a good solder point. And we're always going to go back whenever we've done anything to it. We're going to go back and check for straightness and check for following our angle. It's out a little bit too much. And yes, we'll be able to do a little touch up to this even after we solder it together. So it's not deadly, but it's good to get in the habit of being as precise as you can at this phase. It'll sort of follow through. Any mistake you make is likely to multiply down the stream if you haven't corrected it by the time you get to your next step. I'm looking for a barrette file. Okay, so all I'm doing on this end is giving myself a little sharp point that will slot in. So I'm just filing from 2 sides to make a little chisel point that will fit cleanly into that little V that I notched out. Okay, so that's what I'm aiming for. Questions on that step? Pretty straightforward. All right, over to the torch. And because we've done a nice job of laying it out, oops, I gotta hit the camera the right way. There we go, and let's zoom back out. So same old, we're setting it up well to begin with, doing our fluxing and so on. And hard solder, remember that John recommends hard solder throughout the entirety of your step bezels. And I can either use chip or wire. I just happen to have the wire right there. When we get to the rest of this, we're going to do the chip probably. Sorry, I got myself a cleaned up brick because the other one was driving me bonkers. So I don't have any solder laid out. Straightforward soldering, another good one for the pick solder, but you could just as easily use tweezers, pick a piece up and put it down. And since we're going to eventually cut this away, be generous, because it's just going to be helping you hold things together. Like, don't go light on this solder. There you go. It's also a great starting exercise for creating object. Like, that's kind of a neat component that you can work your way off of. Chain links off of it, all kinds of fun things that you could do once you've got a nice clean trillion point, or, 3-pointed something. All right. Next up, we go back to our bench and we're looking for a fairly good sized DAP dome device. I want something that's going to be close to the curve of the stone that I'm aiming for, the outer diameter, the outer dimensions of it. Probably a little snug of that. And you could put this in a DAP, or if it's this lightweight, sometimes you can just shape it over. Because all we're doing is using the DAP for its curvature. And I missed a step. I should have double checked that my lines were still meeting the angles. They're a little off. I can still salvage that a bit if I torque things out a bit. Should have put it down on the paper though first. And I'm really regretting not having my mallet with me. I'm going to use this instead. So by the time, if you've picked a piece that's pretty much the same size, by the time you've done that, look at this. It's already holding the stone because we've done a dome over the nice, the close match to the size of the stone, which is a good sign because we're going to be putting rings in to fit to that, right? So whereas in the set of 4, we did things a little bit opposite this. We did our rings first. This one, we now know what we're aiming for. We're still going to base the rings off of the stone. And the big difference with cabochon versus faceted is that our cabochon is not going to have any material cutting down below the top level, right? So unlike in the earlier setting, we don't have as much leeway about the size of the ring that we need under there. It can't be too small, or else our wire prongs are going to have to come out before they cut back in over, making it a weaker setting. So we want to be very close to the outside, to just inside the diameter of the stone. We don't want to go outside. It can't be bigger than the diameter, but we do want it to be close. And another nice thing is that on a cab setting, you can use a piece of square wire for the rings and it'll sit nice and flat, right? So sometimes it's worth maybe doing your rings in a square wire. I'm going to stick with the round. It'll sit on either. It's just sometimes the flat, wide square is going to do a better job. So the other nice thing about having just picked something that is pretty close to pretty darn close to what I need. This is another one of those situations where I was taught all my life that you always have 2 levels if you're doing a basket setting. But John pointed out earlier in the chapter that we don't necessarily need that. I'm going to do both because I want to show that series of solder joins that we have to do. Ooh, way too big. Pull that down a lot. too much spring in this material. I got to work a little bit smaller than that. But yeah, you could ostensibly just make this prong set with only the one base layer, the base ring. Still a little too big, so I'm going to just cut it smaller than I have coiled.
Which chapter or where does it say that you can do it with just one ring?
To me, because I've so grown up with the thou shalt always have 2 rings. So on page 92 on the right hand column, he says, though most wire settings have 2 bearings, an upper and a lower, this is more a matter of convention than of function.
Ah, okay, got it.
Yeah, a wire setting may be fabricated with additional bearings can be added for design purposes. So you could, have 5 bearings if you want to multiply the number of tiny little solder joints you want to play with. Yeah, that was a bit of a thinker for me. And I still, my gut is telling me that it's going to be a little bit riskier. Like, depends on the form and function balance for me as to whether there may be certain situations where I'd be more comfortable with that, like a pendant laying on the neck. I'd probably be more comfortable with a 1 bearing setting than, say, a ring, or I'd go with a much heavier gauge wire. That's the other option, is you're making something that's less likely to move. Looks like it's gonna do. That's still a little big. All right, and I'm gonna make my first ring to make sure I'm happy with the scale, with the size of it, and then I'll come back and make my second ring. A little bit of touch-up filing on that cut. And otherwise, conceptually, this is the same thing as our steps, as our first round of steps in the 4-prong. It's just that we're doing all 3 in one pass. Whereas on the other setting, we did 2 and got them positioned and solid, and then the other 2. All the more important that at each prong solder, we then confirm that our others are positioned where we want them to be. I'm just going to solder this jump ring. And I am going to pull out my glitter solder just because I need to get in better habits around using minimal levels of solder on these small settings. I tend to err on the side of extra solder, and I need to work on trimming it back to just the bare minimum, so I'm not flooding my work. That's true when you're working on chains. It's true. It's true in any soldering exercise, but some of the places that it's most obvious are settings and chains. All right, we're going to round this up on a mandrel. If I did not take my mandrel away, I did not. Okay, good old basic.
Change camera.
Oops, not the right camera. Sorry about that. Okay, you guys have seen me do this in earlier sessions where I'm using the downward force of pushing it against the steel of my bench block to help round it quickly. Again, I would be doing this with my mallet if I had my mallet in front of me. Eyes. Then stretch. So I am, let me see if I can show you guys from this side. I'm at sort of the smallest I think I'd want for this stone. I don't want, well, no, it's actually pretty good size for this stone. I could go a smidge smaller. I wouldn't go larger than this because I need to have it hidden beneath. Otherwise, I'm going to have let me draw this one. I don't want gapping. So here's my ring. And if my stone is coming up like this, I don't want gapping. So I don't want this ring sticking out beyond the edge of the stone, or else I'm starting with a natural gap and having to push in. That makes for a weak setting. What I want is for this ring to be just barely under so that my wire is running the edge of the stone. That's what keeps it close. If I have the butt pooch thing happening, if I have it doing this, then it's more likely that it's going to catch and open if somebody catches it on a sweater or something like that. So fairly decent fit on that. And now I can make my relative size smaller jump ring, or I could make one exactly the same size. What I don't want, and he's got great drawings for us back on where did he put those? He talks about what angled or vertical sides on page 92 a little bit. And then on page 94 at the top, he shows the maximum differential he's recommending. So I'm going to try for this one being a little smaller just to get some taper to my design. And this really is, until it becomes too big or too small a difference, it's really an aesthetic of the design you're going for rather than a functional thing. So whether it's the same size or smaller, doesn't much matter as long as it doesn't get too much smaller.
But isn't the drawing showing that there's a indentation in the rings, or no?
Yes, yeah, that's our next step. Once we've got the rings made, we're going to be filing in to set our prongs against it. So that's what, if you were to go too far over,
Right.
it's going to go beyond. So, but right up to the wall of the stone, that's why we're saying it can be the size of the stone, but not more than. You don't want any of the bearing hanging off the edge. And you
Got
don't
it.
want it too close in, or else you're not going to, your prong is going to go out before it comes in.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. And as with all things, both that John teaches and that I'm talking through in here, and there are as many ways to do these things as there are instructors in the world. And my basic rule of thumb is one of, I don't want my jewelry to break on the wearer if I can help it. But if there's a funky way to get to something still that it won't risk being much more fragile, go for it. If you can come up with a different style of prong setting, try it. And your gauge of metal is going to impact what flexibility, what range of things you can do. The material, 14 karat gold prong is going to be much more durable than a sterling silver one of the same gauge. Platinum, there's in fine jewelry, a lot of people will only make their prongs out of platinum because of the durability. I don't know. I haven't ever in my life worked with platinum, so I can't attest to that personally. It's just something I hear a lot about on my jewelers groups, is always get that platinum crown. for a wedding band. If anybody's worked with various golds extensively and or platinums and have opinions on it, type up. Because I can't afford to work in those metals as much as I want to. But it's really definitely not a form or function. It's a form and function consideration. How many prongs? How thick is the material? What kind of stone is it holding? What kind of purpose is it worn for? Rings are different than necklaces, that are different than bracelets, that are different than earrings. Okay, ring number 2, we're gonna go back and round it. Okay, once again. So this little three pod thing, the tripod thing that we've got going on here, there was a children's science fiction series that I read as a kid called Day of the Tripods or something. One of the most disturbing science fiction stories I have ever read to that point in time. My dad got me into science fiction very early on. They had these little tripod critters that were coming around and taking people. And so it's giving these little images of that book.
Nightmare.
Christopher Stashup, I think. No, that's not right. I can't remember who the author was. Christopher somebody. Okay, somehow I managed, even though I cut it smaller, I managed to make exactly the same size ring. So I'm going to put that aside or I'm going to just trim it down. I could have sworn I sized it down.
Now,
way.
how much smaller is the smaller one or the opposite?
That's what I mean by it's that balance of design versus function thing.
Hmm.
So if you look on that page 94 drawing up at the top, John has some drawings of his opinion of the proportions that you care about, where a little bit of taper is a good thing. A lot of taper starts to make it hard for the prongs to hold on.
Oh, I see the example. Yeah.
Yep. So it's that delicate dance of, is it enough taper to give a visual impact of being a tapered bezel versus is it too much taper to make it a non-functional bezel? So I'm going with one that barely doesn't fit inside. So it's not quite the inner diameter of the ring. And I would actually bet that in most cases, proportionally, if you make a ring that just fits inside of your larger ring, you'll be on a good taper. Whenever you're doing a basic, if you haven't got a strong opinion about what taper you want, start there.
Good idea. Thank you.
Sure. I mean, it's going to really depend on the scale of your wire and the scale of the project. A tiny jump ring versus a tinier jump ring is not going to give you such an impact as when I'm working this scale.
Right.
Okay, let's try resoldering, a little bit smaller. And what we haven't done a lot of talking about is the use of these. I mean, as a project, for me, this is an exercise in the making of the bezels. So something that I encourage you to do is think about whether all the steps, some bezels, their steps can all be done before you put them on a project, and others you want to sort of pause at a certain point and incorporate it into your work. So some certain types of bezels, as soon as you get a cool stone, you could make a bezel and just leave it sitting with your stone, knowing that then when you're ready for something inspired by that stone, then you've got a setting for it. Other things you may want to custom make to the project, or you may only be able to get so far in the setting. like all those reverse settings, they make more sense when we have a specific project to build them into than they do just making them as floating exercises like we're doing for our sampler pack of settings. All right, that's better. So now I've got the 2 rings rounded, and I'm going to have my settings with the bearings. Gotta put the right one in first. With the bearings slightly angled by the time they're in place. I'm not going to show well because I can't really hold it. I need one more hand. So I'm going to have them proportionally, so it's going to travel the angle outward of the differential between the smaller ring and the bigger ring. And then my stone will rest nicely on top of that bigger ring that I've made just to the dimensions of the stone, basically. So that's where we're headed. Questions thus far? I just want to make sure that he doesn't tell us to do anything different on the 3 prongs and start with the bottom setting. Yes, we're going to start with the bottom one. All right, so we're on our mission now. Oops, I'm going to have to tuck this a little snugger than I did because it's too, since I'm going to a tapered, which means I need something more like that. So I've just got to get a little bit snugger in, and whenever I'm adjusting my layout on this, I'm going to need to go back to my template and make sure I didn't go out of kilter on how they're laid out relative to each other. So just bringing that little paper template back and checking to make sure that the center of my prongs, oops, one's going a little wonky. My prongs are all still in keeping with my 3 points. Got to tweak it a little bit to one side from the mix. So when in doubt, make sure you rotate. It should be looking the same no matter which prong you put down on which of your mapping arms, if you're using one of the evenly spaced templates, right? Because sometimes that'll show you that one of the straight down at this, I'm also looking at my upright bars to make sure I'm keeping those fairly vertical, that I haven't added in any bends down at the bottom, which will make it harder to get them straight once I put this in place. So I'm looking pretty good. Now I care about, is it tight enough of a fit that the jump ring will sit in there? It is excellent. Okay, now I'm going to use the same template to mark bottom bearing ring, the one that's going to be the flat surface that I'm using to attach things to, not the one that's going to hold the stone. And John's recommendation for this is that we Sharpie the top, because it is going to become important. Remember that when we're doing a tapered bezel, we need to also file along the taper so that we're building in the progression that it makes to the upper taper. And then scoring the marks at my 3 points. If I can find my scoring device. So I've got 1. It's not showing it all. One, 2, and 3. Oop. We're good. Okay. And as with last week's setting, now that we've got our marks in place, we're starting with our saw marks to get a kickstart for where our file is going to go. starting a little bit so that I have someplace to put my tooth of the file. And then once I've got the saw mark in, I'm switching over to the triangle file. But this is where it's important. Start thinking not of a vertical file, but of an angled file, so that we are using the top always as the top, and we're putting our little notch in, starting to head upward. So if you drop it, make sure that you figured out which is the top side again. That's why we mark only the one side. And that you're always filing in that upward angle direction. All right, once I've done a little bit with the triangle notch, I'm coming back in with one of my tiny little round files. If you ever come across watchmakers files, they have some of the best teeny tiny little round files ever. So I'm making my notch. If I were using square wire, I would be trying to make a more square notch. If I were using half round, I would probably make it also a sort of a squarish rectangular notch. The goal being to have the material of our prongs resting nicely against those points. And ideally, it's going to be snug and level once you've got it notched in. Not have a deep enough notch yet. Still on the top, so I'm still angling. Boy, if nothing else, these sessions online are giving me magical fingers for angled, weirdly angled, so I don't block your view filing capabilities. All right, so I have gone overboard with my angling out. I need to give myself a little bit more of a notch towards the top of the ring, so it's got a little catch point. And then we're going to get set up with the magical tweezers that we made, because holy cow, those were game changers. All right, so I have got a rough fit right now, which is good enough to get me to position it in a pair of the tweezers, because I'm going to solder one spot, pause, and reposition. Meaning I'm not locked in until I've actually put my second solder joint down. I gotta hold this better before I position it. So as a reminder, what we're doing is we're lining up the prong in the vertical cut that we made in the pliers, in the tweezers, and then we're putting the circle of the bearing in one of the horizontal notches. And we need to make sure that once we've got that done, we can still connect to the other side. So what I'm discovering is I don't have this snug enough yet, and I need to close my prongs in on each other even further than I have. I'm going to start doing this with a little bit of the plier action and then come back and test it again. So still meeting my reprong layout, looking pretty good. Bottom bearing with the top side facing up, which is that side. So when it's working well, you'll find that the notches line up with what you expect on the rest of the prongs, even when you're at this phase of it, because it means you've marked your prong spots correctly and you've made your prongs the right dimensions relative to, you know, the angles are correct and so on. If it's fighting you, it probably means that one or the other of your measurements is a little off. It's fighting me a little bit. So let me see if I still need to squeeze this in. There's always fiddly bits, no matter what we're working on. This is definitely a trickier setup than when we were working 2 and 2, because 2 and 2, you're always just straight across from one another. So the pressure from the far side is what's helping hold you exactly where you want. But now I've got 2 sides that are sort of fighting for pick me next kind of control. Oh, come on, little guy. Up the chain a little bit more.
I just printed what you posted on Facebook. This is great.
Good. Again, you can make your own versions of it in different scales and different quantities. If somebody wants to make that like 43 prong setting, you go for it. We'll get a layout.
Yeah.
Okay. I am going to try that, see if I've got it snug enough. So whereas when we were doing the 2 opposite each other, our soldering exercise was really across the way from what we were holding. Keep in mind that the more prongs you put, the more likely you are to have to do something at some point that is soldering quite close to the steel. And as we recall, steel steals the heat. So we got to be aware of it. Doesn't mean it's going to stop us. And in this case, we're using the chip solder. My instinct would have been to go down to a smaller torch tip, but John does everything like this with his one. I think maybe if I worked a lot smaller, I would end up switching out, but I'm going to be aiming for this prong right out here, this outer prong, as I work on this. So
You're off camera,
Oh.
Rachel.
Thank you. I don't know if I can zoom out more. Let me see. Nope, I'm as zoomed as I can get, so I'm going to just try to keep things a little lower. And what I'm doing is putting some solder in. Way too much solder. Putting a little solder on the inside at the join point. Yeah, I can't keep it in camera and keep it all in hand. So I'm going to set it up like that. So I'm aiming for resting my solder on the back of the prong. Once I've got it in place, then I can do a little bit more of the controlled activity. Getting it to flow. And this is a lot of that flick action where we're not overheating the other joins. We're just trying to get it flowed right down into that one. The temptation, and I fall for it all the time, the temptation is to go straight into soldering another one. Do not fall for that temptation. Always between your prongs, pause, quench it, go back to your map and make sure that you're straightening everything out. Because that way leads to misaligned prongs, is if you try to do all your steps at once. Because here's the thing, you may think, wow, I got it set up perfectly. And you did, until you hit it with heat and it warped. So don't assume that you can just go straight from one setting, one prong to the next. So what I'm going to do now is come in and position my prongs again. And that's going to include straightening them. So this is the one I soldered. I'm going to try and position the others relative to it. And I'm working on making sure that I have leveled my bearing relative to the work I've already done. So if I had thought about it, I would have dapped this out a little bit more to get a lower position, but I've got plenty of material. I'm not too worried about it. But I now need to make sure that at least one of my other notches is well in place and close fitting. One of the problems I run into is that I think I've got it butted up against, but it's a little hard to see and a little hard to get the pressure you need, like the tightness, the snugness of fit. So I'll sometimes find that I skip the little slot. It bounces out. I can't get the solder join simply because it's not snug enough. So whichever of your next two join points is really, really snugly fitting, grip the other one and focus on soldering the one that's a close fit. And again, always good to check how you're lining up. And at some point, if you can keep your prongs straight enough, you can also check from the other direction. It's a little harder to tell, but make sure that when you're looking at it this way, your prongs are on their lines. So I've got one that's a little wonky. And it's the only one that I can't move, so I've got to move the others relative to it. All right, so I'm now going to put myself back in the tweezers, magic tweezers, focusing on, I'm going to grip the one that is not fully lined up in favor of the one that is snugly in its little notch that I've made. This is not very well notched, so that's the one I'm focusing on soldering, is right here. Right here. Okay, back to the block. And obviously, the more prongs you put on here, the more likely you are to open one up as you're soldering, because we're trying to do this all with that hard solder. That's why you need that quick flick and move action, so that you're focusing really underneath the joint point of the pieces you're soldering in the immediate, and not touching so much on the other pieces. Keep the solder small-ish. Tuck it in the corner. Oop. There's one of my prongs wanting to melt on me. This is why John likes to solder from underneath instead of above, and I should remember that. Okay, I gotta pause because it's warped enough that it's moving out of position. Line it back up. Having it by the opposite side. Go. Okay. Remember to pause, remember to clench, remember to go reposition. So this is your last shot to get a nice start to your 3 equal prongs. And with the amount that I melted that one, it's definitely needing straightening up. Okay, and our last one is soldering. So one of the tricky parts is is how do you get it snug enough up against the little notch if it's gotten a little warped, and it's the it's the spring action that keeps it pulling away, so it wants to bounce back from it. So you sort of have to overcompensate by how much you push across, forward and back rather, you know, bend and then push in like you were closing a jump ring basically. But it's quite hard to get it well positioned when it's moved away. And we need to check our other plane to make sure that we are in fact as lined up as we want to be. Checking positions. Ooh, I'm way off. So you'd think, in theory, that because we marked our 3 positions, that we'd be in good shape no matter what we do. And that's kind of true within the bounds of putting on the lower bearing, but as soon as you attach your first component of the upper bearing, you're pretty well locked in. So that's why I'm being so particular about getting lined up before I go to the final solder on this ring. And once again, we get the good old tweezers. Grab a side that has been soldered. Back to the bench. I really do need to remember that whole solder from underneath thing because it really flows a lot better into the space. It's so counter to things that I've grown up with. But it really does the trick. So we've now got our base down. We're going back, and this is why we don't cut the notches into our bigger round, to our upper bearing, is we now need to really get this all straightened out and positioned before we put our very first notches into it. So I've got this 3-prong setup. I'm going to be putting in the larger, hopefully angled out a bit, ring, but I need it to be a tight, neat fit, and I need to figure out where I want it relative to the ring below it. So how much gap between the two. And there's some good drawings from John about what's too much and what's too little, in terms of like, are you making an earring? Is it going to flop over if you make if there's too much distance between them or not? And this will be not a clean fit yet because we don't have the notches in, but what it does is give us a sense of just how much taper we're going to have when we're done, depending on how far down we go with this. So if I'm pushing this further down, I can, but what I need now is to make sure that my prongs are all absolutely straight as can be.
Oh,
Oop, you okay?
oh, sorry. Sorry.
It's okay. Just want to make sure you're all right.
I'm okay.
So I need these to be super straight, and I need to make sure that they're following my pattern so that I'm equidistant. And these are not quite off by a fair amount at this point, so I'm going to do a little tweaking. I also am going to trim them so they're actually a little closer to even, because that's throwing my tripod off a bit. So some of it's going to be about the angle that they're pointing outward at, and others of it may be about their left-right angle. So all equal in the directions they're pointing. I'm trying to figure out if I missed my, all right, gang, we have another repair to do. So in the heat, the last one I soldered shifted over a bit. So it's a little, so the reason that it's not lining up with my pattern is because one of my prongs decided to go ever so slightly sideways. Oh, maybe I managed to recover. No, it's definitely a little wonky. It's pointing backwards. So when this prong is pointing straight, I'm off kilter. And it's because, so I'm going to show it with a Sharpie or something. So this guy right here should be tucked in a step further this way, but he's stuck to the edge of what I carved in. So we're going to try a repair. Is it big enough of a difference that the average eye would notice? No, but the average jeweler eye would. So we're going to correct. All right, so how are we going to tackle this? We're going to put our stuff in the grippy tweezers again. And I am thinking that I'm going to actually support it a little bit by, like, I don't want it to move. I want to be able to push and try and sneak. Oh, that's the wrong direction. I'm going to be going the other way. I'm going to try and sneak the wire over a smidge while it flows, with just by pushing it with tweezers or something. So this is going to be a little tricky, but it's recoverable, hopefully. So once again, we just have to get it to a flow point. Got to be pointing the right direction when it flows. go. All right. That was a tricky one. It wanted to come apart up at the top, but we got it moved over quickly enough. So it's now sitting properly in the slot that it was intended to sit in. Still a little bit wonky because I had to sort of push it that way, but we're going to be in better shape than we were before the repair was attempted. Once again, never assume that it comes out of the fire straight, and you're going to need to tighten everything up before you check it. And we'll make sure that it did in fact improve things. Holy cow, so much better. Yay, we're back on track. Okay, so you'll notice like this becomes my Bible until I've got these all together. So now I have a chance to put my setting in relatively evenly. And again, I'm measuring this time against the prongs themselves rather than the marker setting, because if there is still any minor discrepancy in the prongs, I want to follow that discrepancy instead of trying to work against it. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm trying to work off of the now new pattern, which is what have I already built, rather than assuming that I'm so good at my job that I managed to line it up perfectly with the pattern. So I'm scoring where I'm going to be doing my file down. I've marked my top because it's even more important on the top one. Oh, jump ring. You don't have to live up to your name. There we go. So it's even more important because I'm now hitting my outward angle that I follow not a straight up and down sawing and filing, but a one that follows the path of the angle that we're following, the creation of the angle in the difference between the small bearing and the big bearing. Starting one mark. Another. This one. Going first to the triangle. And again, I'm aiming to not file up and down, but to file out at an angle. Always remembering which is the top that I've marked. Just enough to get the notch started. And then we'll move to the round. Okay, switching over to my round file, which constantly tries to hide on me. Following that angle again. Okay, let's see how we're doing for lining up. Ugh, badly. That's how we're doing. What did I do? Wowza. Super badly. Must have completely mismarked something. Flip the piece. No, that's not it. Well, I must have radically mismarked one, so I'm going to have to remark, and I'm going to end up doing a little solder fill where the other mark is, which is a cheater way of handling it. Sometimes you got to do what you got to do. It's better. All right, and then the tricky part is that we have to make sure that we're getting the spacing we want. That's actually pretty nice spacing. I'm going to choose to solder this guy first because I like where he's positioned, which means I'm going to grab the other side with the tweezers. Focus on that solder joint. So remember, we now have a hard solder joint right above the one that we're about to do. So it becomes a little more precarious. Quick flickering motions. Set the solder in place. Just inside. Soldering from beneath. There we go. As always, we're pausing between each step. Checking our positioning, and this time it's very important we check the height around the piece. Bring my tweezers with me. So as you can probably see, even on the camera that doesn't go terribly close up, I'm a lot closer together on one side than on the other. So one thing you can do is grab, say, one of your a flat nail or a piece of wood or something that is a consistent size across it. If you're doing very small bezels, you might just take a file and put it in there. But what you need is whatever the height you've set as your first position, you want the others brought up to an equal distance to that. And what I'm seeing is that I am not close to an equal distance on one side, but we're looking pretty good elsewhere. So I'm adjusting for that. If you are super meticulous, you could take a pair of calipers out. I mean, a pair of, yeah, you could use dividers, you could use a caliper, whatever, to try and make sure that you get your measurement clean all the way around. So checking the distance between your soldered 2 points that you just finished. And the next slot over. pretty good. Back into our magical tweezers. I think I am going to fight the, oops, wrong side. I'm going to fight the one that I had to refile last because that gives me maximum cleanup flexibility. I do this guy first. So if you're working with the chip solder from Rio, I'm tending to pick up 2 to 3 of the tiny little pieces for this scale of join. Again, I'm personally trying to work my way down. I should be trying 1 to 2 pieces instead. No. But it's hard to wean yourself off too much solder. All right, so we now have one side, the other side. This is our, oh, no, one side, the other side, which is my wonky one. This is my wonky one. This one needs cleaning up. And it's got a little divot in it that we got to straighten out before we solder it in. Even when you've got 2 sides in, it's worth making sure you check all of your measurements, all of your distances. Just gonna tuck in there with some small pliers to get this guy back into shape. Sorry, I'm blocking you guys with my head. Questions while I'm doing this last little tightening up? Anybody? Guys still out there?
So
We're still here.
could you, like, could you stick something in between the rings
Yes.
and solder with it, like with
It-
something in there, like a titanium or something?
Yes, you could. It's sort of pushing the risk factor of whether you're going to get soldered. You know, titanium in theory is really, really hard, but nothing is impossible to solder together. So yes, the titanium clips might do it, or I've on a tiny one, I've done the steel T-pins between the 2 layers. But you do run the risk. I mean, you've got a lot of things going on there and a lot of parts of it that can flow. So try, experiment. So what I'm going to point out to you guys here, make sure that I've got that marked. This is that first accidental mark I made. Before I got us back onto following the triangle, which I'm doing this solder down. I'm also going to try and toss a little solder there. If it doesn't want to go right away, I may end up coming back with a medium solder pass.
So I was always taught that solder doesn't fill gaps.
Silver solder fills some gaps if you're careful about it. It's not professional to leave in your work that way in big flows. Gold solder really doesn't want to fill gaps. But it's not entirely true that it doesn't fill gaps at all.
So if this was a piece that you were making to sell, or, you know, somebody had commissioned from you, would you have remade the jump ring then and redone it?
Yes. Yeah, just because, so here's the real reason that you don't want lots and lots of solder filling things. If they take it to another jeweler because you're not around, or they're in a different, they moved to a different city or whatever, and that jeweler goes to make repairs. If you solder filled, they're going to flow it out of the solder. And so it's going to really, you know, it's going to potentially ruin another jeweler's day, but also potentially ruin your work because they don't know it, you know. Sure, sometimes you can see the solder seams, but it's not always apparent, especially if you've done any kinds of treatments or what have you. So it's a risk. I'm more likely to do a little bit of solder filling on a heavy gauge chain link than I am on something delicate like this, for example.
No, did John ever say why does he like the flickering thing when you're soldering?
Yeah, I asked him about it because it's kind of a weird little thing, and he does it a lot. He doesn't just do it on these delicate things. What it's doing is, because of the way silver shares its heat across the work, it's giving it a chance to even out, to level out that that heat transmission. So if you're too much in one spot, you're really focusing all of the, like, it's all drawing the heat centrally, but this balances all the places that we need it to flow. There we go. It gives the heating spreads and levels out before you overheat the spot that you've been facing.
Oh.
That's the best I can do in translating what he tried to explain to me. I'm not sure I'm doing it justice. So, yeah.
I mean, you're not using yellow ochre or any of those things, but you are using hard solder in all the joints.
Yep.
So I'm guessing that's the only reason, because it's gonna come apart if you.
So he does this even if he's doing a second, if he's doing a medium solder. I'm just gonna put this in the pickle. I'll be back on screen in a sec. He does the flickering action in almost all his fine solder work that I've observed him doing. He only blasts directly when he's doing something larger scale. And even then there's a fair amount of circling and spreading the heat. So it's not about it being hard solder, because remember that every time solder flows, a component, a portion of what makes it flow is burning off. So the first hard solder, it takes a micro degree more to flow a second time than whatever the fresh solder is doing. It's why if you have a solder joint that's not perfect yet, you'll do better adding a dollop of fresh solder to it to get it to reflow when you're trying to fix something, because it's that minute temperature differential that just says, remind you, you're supposed to flow at this temperature. And so I think part of that flicking is, he's done, maybe I can find in my notes of his drawings. He's done a little bit of describing of the way that the molecules transmit heat in silver. Again, very different behavior in gold. But in silver, how it is spreading across the material that the metal, not the solder, but the whole piece, bringing it back to so if I'm heating too much right where I'm trying to get it to flow, while we know solder follows the heat, it's not going to skip. Like if it's too cool on the outside and then it's super hot, it won't necessarily be encouraged to go where you want it to go until you've told it, hey, this is a safe path to travel. I guess that's my interpretation of what he's talked about. Like it needs to have enough heat to go, come hither, little piece of solder, instead of go, here's where you go, jump over. And that's sort of what I get as why he does that flicker. It's been a hard one for me to engage. Like it's not natural to me.
That's my guess also.
Yeah, it does. It works. So try it when you're just like, I risk melting my prongs all the time. You saw I warped that first prong. I do that all the time because I'm not balancing my heat. As soon as I remember the go from underneath and do the flickers, it helps. So yeah. Any questions about that?
Well, just as a comment on that. Yep. I know a number of fine jewelers who do that flickering with their work, more so than like art jewelers and stuff like that, and they just tend to do it. So I don't know if they all learned it from the same place.
Yeah,
or
maybe
it's
it's
just,
a German tradition.
But yeah, it could be.
Yeah. So play with it.
So I have a comment too about that. I was taught that just a few weeks ago to solder a spring ring clasp onto a chain. So I had a tiny gauge jump ring, and so we blocked the clasp with a razor blade so it wouldn't
Yeah.
get too much heat, and we hung the chain off. And then they taught me to use hard solder and do the flicker to
Yeah.
avoid overheating it.
Nice.
And it took a little longer, but it did work. And so both of the people that were teaching me that, they had been classically trained, one in Calgary in Italy, and the other person went to GRS, the GRS school.
Okay.
So perhaps that is a characteristic of fine goldsmiths.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, it may also be whether you started in gold or you started in silver, although
Mm.
John started in silver and stayed in silver. So he doesn't do a hell of a lot of gold work, to my understanding. But it may be that tradition, because in gold, you really do only want to heat the location that you're soldering, because it doesn't do the transmission of heat in the same manner as silver. So it's even more, like, I do even more flickering with gold, and funny, because when I work with gold, I just flicker automatically. So I haven't even thought about that. I'm betting it's a combination of the material basis that you started in and your training. But it's functional, and you're going to find that you're going to melt prongs, and you're going to warp prongs, and you're going to do all, and then you're going to start to flicker, and you'll be like, oh, hey, not melting as many prongs, not having things fall apart on me. So I think that we are at a good breaking point, although when this comes out of the pickle, I'll pull it and do the basic trim so we can see the stone resting on it. I was going to do a 7 today, but that's clearly not happening. I'm going to suggest that I'm hoping that, having seen the 3, you guys can extrapolate other odd numbers and other even numbers from the 2 different ones that we've done. So I'm going to move on to other shapes when we go to our next basket setting. Unless anybody is screaming, no, I must see the 7. The 7 is the one I want. I actually want to do the 7 at some point, because I just like that. Like, 7 is a neat holding number, but I need to find the right stone for it. Faceted stone I was going to do it for, but I'll do that another time on my own. So this is one of those practice things. Every time I make a prong setting, a basket setting, I remember the details again, and I need to, like, really think through. But this new website for finding the mappings, template, and paper is relatively cheap, so I can make multiple copies. But I suppose if you really had a favorite layout, you could probably, like, put it in laminate or something and have a bunch of little discs that you just have at your bench, and use erasable markers on it when you want to add details temporarily. It's just nice to have a mechanically precise layout that doesn't have a whole bunch of other crud in the way that you can accidentally look at instead. So last questions, and then anybody have anything for show and tell? I hope anything, doesn't have to be these settings. It's been a busy couple of weeks for everybody, I'm betting. It's summertime, vacation time. Anybody have anything they want to share? All right, gang.
No.
Then we're gonna call it there. And I hope that next session, 2 weeks from now, I see at least 1 or 2 in progress basket settings. Pretty please.
Maybe.
Maybe. Okay.
I'll try my best.
Say again.
Will try my best.
Yes. So even if it's just starting, start to make the proportional rings and so on, and get a feel for the steps. This is one of those ones that's really, like, if you go by the numbers, it starts to work. If you skip steps, it screws up. Just basics. It's hard to recover from. I'm kind of glad that I had 2 recoveries I had to make. Oh, and I'm going to pull this out of the pickle so you can see what I got by blobbing the solder on there to fill it. But yeah, live with your mistakes, and make this as practice, not as permanent. So let's see if I can I'm going to do it on this close-up camera to see if I can show you a little better. Yes, we are on the close-up camera. So let me see if I can even tell where I did that blobby stuff. Holy cow. Oh, there we go. All right, so I gotta zoom in and I've got to see what I'm zooming in on. So let me get rid of that and zoom. Focus. Focus, maybe. There we go. Okay. So here is the blob that I filled in to fill that gap that I made by filing twice.
Right.
So it's a big blob of solder. And I'm going to have some very precarious filing to get in there because I'm going to have to try and recreate the curve. It's not impossible, but the amount of time I saved by filling is probably going to equal or be less time. You know, it's going to take me more time to clean this up with files than it would have potentially if I weren't talking through the whole thing and having you guys on board to make another jump ring for the same thing, right? Because jump rings are pretty quick and easy. So from here, we're clipping off our excess. My little tripod goes away. And I don't need that much material on top, but before I get rid of it, I'm going to go grab my stone. Disappeared on me. Where did my stone go? Front row. Give me a sec. Find this little pink stone that has run away. Did you run? Maybe I won't find the little pink stone. Drop it. No. Bear with me, gang. Like to actually see what this looks like with the stone in place.
It wasn't pink.
It was pink.
Wasn't
No.
it green?
Huh?
It was
No,
blue.
wasn't it light green or
Yeah,
light
that's
blue?
what I remember.
Oh, it was
Yeah.
light blue? Oh.
Yeah.
Well,
I would-
blue
I
or
had a
green.
Set of
A
stones. Maybe it
Cal
was.
Sydney or something.
Yeah, that's what
I
it
had
looked
a
like.
set, so, but I'm still not seeing either of those colors on my bench. Oh my goodness. Telling me it's time to call it, I think. I'm gonna have to show it to you guys next time because it is seriously just not here. Did I put it in my pockets? No.
It happens to all of us.
Usually not on such big stones though. Oh, there it is. It fell. I just didn't hear it
Yes.
fall. Okay. Whew. It was blue. You guys were right. I bought these as a set, so I've got a bunch of the pink ones in there too. So it's not going to be a perfect fit yet because we're going to still have to do some notching, even though it's not a faceted stone, but it's pretty darn close. And it's not going to need a whole lot of that bezel, of that prong above. So I could probably take a bunch off of this. But I would do all my filing and cleanup first. If I were going to put any kind of bail and make it into a pendant of some kind, I would do all of that. Get all my soldering done that I can. Sometimes that's not possible. And then when we get to doing the notching, we're going to make sure that we put those notches in just right so that it slides into the prongs nicely. All right.
Okay.
That's
That's
great.
great.
Call it there. And
It looks very nice.
it'll look a lot nicer once I've sanded and filed. I always hate this stage of it because it looks so close to being what you want, but it's not pretty yet. I don't know.
Yeah. It will be
Gang,
very pretty.
we will work on 8/17. We're going to start cutting the seats via hand files and via burrs. We've now got 2 settings that we can do that with. We're also going to do a quick cleanup of a barrette file to do that seat work. And maybe be able to get to a to finishing it up where we're using cup burrs and or files to finish the ends of the prongs. I'm not sure if we'll also try to jam in an actual setting in that class because that's a fair amount that we're going to have to play around with, but we'll see how time goes. Okie doke.
Did you, it's the last, the session before this one, did you have a chance to put it up?
Yep. we're all caught up except for today's, obviously, so I'll
Yeah,
try,
no,
I
yeah.
mean, this one
Mm, I missed that one.
realistically is not likely to happen until late next week at the earliest, but the prior sessions are all caught up. And I put notes in the guide on the chapter 4 section about what you'll find in each video at this point, or which session it was done in, not necessarily directly what's on the video. Okay. Have a
Thanks,
lovely
Rachel.
evening.
Thank
See you in
you.
a couple weeks, and remember that the one after next is not going to happen.